So we're going in hot. I figure, what the fuck? I woke up this morning a little late, admittedly. And by a little late, I mean not at the time that I had tried to control my way to. And so, not really late, but late according to my own expectations and stupid shit. Anyway, I woke up, started moving around, did some push-ups, went and hung from my bar, as I tend to do. Great experience, by the way. It's so nice, especially because when we tend to sleep, we tend to like lift one hip up when we turn onto our side, and so our spine gets all fucking out of alignment and shit. And over years, that's really what's been fucking with me to some degree, is that I just don't pay attention to the alignment of my spine. And so waking up and hanging there after doing some push-ups and stuff, I could just hear it go crack, 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 crack. Awesome feeling, fantastic and satisfying sound. Anyway, decided I would check TikTok and Instagram before getting onto Raw because, we have a job and we have to do these things. And so I went to see if anybody had sent me any more messages, very much like the long chain of messages I got on Saturday. Nothing. Relatively quiet. I went, all right, cool. So I had to go and, do the morning ritual, shit, shower, and shave, that kind of thing. And as I'm looking at TikTok, I'm not going to say during which part of that process, I come across this video of Bashar. And somebody is asking Bashar, why do we keep losing track of our power? And he immediately says, because you've been trained to. Because you have been trained to look outside yourself. Because you've been trained to be afraid. And what's so interesting is that he doesn't recognize that that is the very reason that he must be Bashar in order to be so insightful. Because there is so much that goes with the idea of Daryl. And it was interesting to listen to him go on about the system and about how we're conditioned from a very young age, and that it goes right into our personality. It goes right into who we think we are. And so in order for Daryl to find an insight outside the realm of Daryl, he created an alter ego that's not even from this fucking planet, that was never subject to that conditioning. And what's so interesting is that state of mind, it's that mentality, it's that framework that allows him to see the world as it is, to be as insightful as he is. You don't have to be an extraterrestrial to realize that you were never, ever really the product of the conditioning of the system. You can come right back to the moment that you've always been, where awareness has choice, whereas the lack of awareness falls into habit, falls into routine, can be led around, looks for something to follow. It's awareness itself. It's the abandoning of the story that makes you able to see the world, to be in the world, but not of it. You don't have to envision yourself as an extraterrestrial. You don't have to remove yourself from the experience of duality. You just have to stop identifying with it. Stop thinking about yourself in the limited way that you do, and allow yourself to simply be here in uncertainty. And all of that insight is there. And what's funny is that somebody on another video I had made about this was saying, oh, so we're just channeling our intuition. Yeah, except for the fact that a channel implies 2 points. So it's not really accurate. There's nothing channeling. There's nothing going from there to there. It's just you being what you are.
And so like how I was kind of thinking of this as you're talking, like if, as we're born, young kids, more or less not as influenced, less influence, whenever baseline. And then it's like there's influences and there's conditioning and all the things that he was talking about in that video that kind of like builds from there. And it's like certain things learned. And then it's like as we become, even just grow up, it's like we kind of build from there and kind of like shift ourselves from this point, from the baseline conditioning that's been trickled down throughout a lot of actions and things, instead of looking at like, oh, there's this stuff that was built here, and almost like going in this direction, like digging into it instead of going back into it. We want to just build on top of it. And that's what he's doing. That's what Daryl does with, you know, Bashar is another. It's like jumping from here, like it couldn't possibly be him because he's this that's here, instead of digging back into just the point here and now, like where you are, what you are, the reality of what you are and what's available there. And it's like this is the pile of stuff that's there. So you almost have to jump it, or uh, try and avoid that in order to experience a little bit of freedom. But it's just from looking at yourself in a certain way, or not being willing to look at yourself and just jumping to being something else. Like I must be something else because I know that I'm this, with all the conditioning that he's talking about coming from the world and society, all the disempowering stuff, instead of going and digging through where that comes from and that it's not actually you.
It's so interesting because there are similarities to what I experience in my life and what I've discussed here on the podcast. Like we have two perspectives of this, or two foundational perspectives of this. One is that you are who you think you are, and the other is just the experience of being. And so both ways of thinking, both conscious environments have different insights, right? And we've talked about this before. There's the insights that involve you being everything, and then there's the insights about you and the shit that you hold on to that keeps you from the recognition that you're everything, both of which are important. There's the dualistic experience and the unifying awareness, as it were, but they're the same thing, right? But there's this gap in between them in terms of their very different perspectives. They're very different perspectives. And so you have to have your a foot in each one. We've talked about this previously. Well, that's what Daryl's doing, but he's making the other perspective, instead of just being subjective awareness of reality itself, he's making it into another identity, an identity with less shit, sure, right? But nonetheless, still an identity. So I wonder, and this is the thing, because I enjoy both sides. Like I really enjoy the insights that go with watching Ray do whatever the fuck is Ray is doing, and then the insights that go with the awareness that I'm not Ray, and watching everything doing what it's doing. There's all kinds of insights on both sides, but does Daryl get to enjoy the insights that Bashar goes through? Because he's not Bashar. So when he's not channeling Bashar, is that part of him still having those great insights, but he just can't hear them? Because that would suck. Like, admittedly, it would suck to only be able to experience these incredible parts of your awareness that are growing in terms of their appreciation of the universe. When you're like, now I'm going to call that part and let it in, as opposed to it just bleeding into your life organically because you're keeping that separation. No, I got to channel it to get it in here. And you're like, no, because they're both sides are happening all the time. If all of a sudden you're turning one off, what's the detriment to your life? Or is that the reason that you can continue to be such a profiteering bastard?
Exactly. Like, is the importance expressing it, or is it taking it in? And I definitely resonate with that. I've talked a couple times, like the last 2 weeks. I've filmed some videos and haven't posted them because I've been wondering, I've been sort of wondering how much my focus was on expressing over actually taking it in, over actually, looking at what my experience might be if I fully were to take some of those in, because there's a prioritization. If you're just trying to feel better about how you think about yourself, or feel better, or, in Bashar and Daryl's case, like reap the benefits of being insightful in expression and not taking the responsibility of, being the source of it, then there's going to be a focus, like the expression of it is almost going to need to be the priority. And there's like a sort of interesting wall of, I don't know if it's cognitive dissonance or what, of just wanting to like avoid the, I don't know, discomfort of looking at what all of that would mean, like what taking all of that in would actually mean. But I guess if you're not willing to look at yourself as and willing to question your own, even just like your own wants, then it's going to be tough to not build another identity, or almost it's almost like a second one. Like if that baseline sort of experience, and then you have a certain amount of, you know, conditioning impacts, call it programming, whatever. It's like that's almost the root of what you think you are, instead of it being reality itself, instead of it being just awareness. And so then it's like, is everyone just creating a second identity and trying to make one that's like the feel better, how I look at myself to feel better, to counteract the way I look at myself to not feel as good? And it's like the bad feeling perspective and the good feeling perspective, and we just swing back and forth
Behold the
between them.
spiritual ego.
Oh, goodness gracious. So then it's just a swing back and forth between that instead of neither. And so, and like, because if you were even just talking to people, and I'm getting more and more experience with like just expressing that I'm not trying to get anywhere so much anymore. Like I'm looking at and seeing the consequence of, that second version of myself, the one where I tried to look at myself to feel better, and seeing that it's it's just a coding that seems like it feels good, but it requires me to think about it, and it puts me at odds with the rest of the world, and immediately creates conflict between myself and everyone else, because it comes, if you're judging yourself in a good way, you're judging everything else relatively. Like feeling good about yourself, it's all in comparison. Like it has to be, until it's not about feeling better about yourself. And it's actually like, what's my experience like right now? Like, how's my experience right now? Because then in taking in your experience right now, it's like, it doesn't matter what you're doing so much anymore. You don't have to buy a new thing. You don't have to be in a specific place, because the root is you. You start to see that the root is you, and there's not a thing you can do or buy or expectation you can meet or pat on the back you can get that's going to make you actually feel better. But then you don't have to rely on those things so much anymore. You don't have to rely on buying a new thing or getting a new thing or accomplishing a new thing or achieving a new thing. Because as long as you're focusing on how you think about yourself, there's going to be, you're going to keep going back and needing more of that stuff, like more of those things, to just keep that train going and then maintaining it. And once you feel like you get enough, then it's about maintenance. It's either about gaining more or maintaining what you got. And you're always going to be at odds with things, instead of looking at, wait, what if I don't need all that? What if I don't need validation at all for anything that I do? But there's admittedly sort of it's not loneliness, but I think it kind of can feel like that in a sense, because it's no one to look to. And I've been wondering, as even if you see that people see you in a certain way, or anything, there's sort of you can, and I'm not saying that this is the case with me necessarily, and I don't even know how this can be expressed, but like, if you see that people look at you in a certain way just from expressing things or just being yourself, like, it's not to say there's almost like this degree of influence that's not control, but it's like influence just on yourself. because you're expressing it not from being something else, but just from being yourself and being honest with yourself about your experience and what you're doing and how you're living and whatnot. And yeah, that's more of like a half baked insight, and I don't really know what that what that
I'd
is,
see where
but
you're going.
yeah.
We went deeper there, and it's hard to hang out there. Um, Imagine if synapses experience insecurity. So as all of a sudden the information comes in, the electrical signal as we look at it comes in, right? And instead of just passing it on by virtue of what it's become, right, in its own way, because every synapse is its own thing, right? It holds on to it and then just releases a little bit because it worries about what the other synapse is going to think. We'd be cutting down on all of our potential all the time. Literally, our brain would be working against itself. Like just by virtue of synapses not working together, we would become dumb. Right? And what's interesting about that is that's exactly what we're doing every time we meet another person. And we're not just being ourselves. We're not just being the synapse we've become. We're not just passing on the information. We're not just relaying the electricity because we don't look at it that way, but that's what it is. There isn't a single thing you're ever going to do or say that isn't the result of quote unquote electricity because it's all just synapses in your brain and electrical signals through your body and everything else. So it's still electricity being transmitted. There's still ripples. Like when you talk to somebody and it wiggles the air and it wiggles their ear, that's all transfer of energy. There's literally no difference between us and synapses. We are always connecting and transferring information and energy. We just look at it as concepts and we look at it as, interactions with one another. And it's because we identify with the process. We identify with this point in the process instead of recognizing that we are the process. And that's the whole point. The point of being yourself is to be yourself. That's it. There's no point to it because that's the ground state. That's where you started before you started getting carried away in your head. Right? That's what you are. There's no to go. There's nothing to become. The whole habit that you have is trying to go somewhere and trying to become something. And so, in letting go of that, you go back to being what you've always been reality itself, God, source consciousness, whatever the fuck you want to call it, however you'd like to aggrandize it, because that's really it. That's all we're ever doing by giving it these fucking awesome names. It's the Tao, Yahweh, the ineffable source. Sounds fucking impressive, right? And yet, when you're like, it's me, all of a sudden you're like, hey, that doesn't sound so impressive. And it's because you have an idea of you. But if you were to realize that source, God, Yahweh, the Tao, the universe, reality itself, the present moment, all these things are synonymous with you. They're synonymous with you. They're just other words for you. But the idea of you contradicts that. The idea of you says, no, I'm these ideas. And we believe that. And it cuts us off from everything that we would be otherwise. And it's just, again, the fact that, and Bashar says it's fear. Part of it's also just, it's easy to do. It's a tool. It's kind of like when we're kids, we talked about this before. Even Louis C.K. talked about this in one of his skits. Kids, when they lie for the first time and somebody believes them, like, holy shit. Did that just work? Did I just get what I wanted by not telling the truth? And that powerful mechanism is running rampant throughout the rest of our fucking life. We actually convince ourselves that we can get what we want. More importantly, that we need what we want, all of which are lies. Right? And we do it all the time, convincingly. We lie to ourselves about how limited we are, and it cuts us off from how limitless we are. It cuts us off from the experience of being ourselves without the borders that are simply man made, created by our own awareness. Oh God, I can't talk. This person might look at me in a certain way, or worse, I have to talk. This person's going to look at me in a certain way. I need to make them go look at me in this way. So it's just trying to manipulate. There's always a goal, there's always an end result. Well, why? Because you can't exist without it. You need that end result. You need that perspective of yourself. You need that validation. You need that journey. You need that fucking achievement. You need to feel like you're going somewhere. And why do you need to? Habit. Habit, because you've looked at yourself in a very limited way for a very long time. And if you identify in a very limited way, then you're going to look at yourself having very certain needs. So the whole point is always just be yourself, relax. I love the fact that I think it was Raw 149. We were talking about the chart of consciousness. And I released that clip on TikTok, and somebody said at the end of it, so the highest point of this is just authenticity. It's like, yeah, that's the enlightenment. That you are and always have been you, regardless of what you've told yourself. And that the best thing that you can do for anybody is to be you. And trust in that. And what's interesting is that people, well, so no accountability? No, constant accountability. Constant accountability with every ripple that you make. But that's the point. You're there. You're you're paying attention to them instead of looking down the road to ripples that don't exist yet, or looking back at your preferences about the ripples that have happened. You're actually involved with each and every fucking ripple you make. And you're involved with it because, well, it's you. It's not even a ripple. Isn't that funny? It's another divisive mentality. It's another divisive way of looking at it. I'm rippling. It's like a drop saying, I'm moving the pond.
All right. And just wanting to take ownership of something, of some experience. Like even that this experience right now is mine, or I'm not just this entire experience right now. There's something in this experience that I can control, or I think that I can control. Either I think I can control the entire experience, or I'm willing to recognize that I can't. Because if I think I can control the entire experience, my experience stems from me, and so I'm going to try and control myself. I'm going to try and have sway over that expression that that expression that can feel, as much as it's like, you're God, you're everything. And we have this, and it's like that's a fucking another idea of like this all and everything, and like all these things that the world's come up with in religion of like almighty. And it's not saying that it's not, but it's like this big thing, and then it contradicts expressing yourself, and like which can feel almost more, you know, playful and silly and childlike, and all of those things, because that's it's like that's the closest to a state of relaxation that we're able to identify almost, because like we don't see adults being relaxed as much, and so we don't see a balance of the goofiness, silliness, and the accountability and the responsibility, because accountability and responsibility, like they're pitched as these sort of things. Like being responsible is being responsible for yourself. That's kind of what you're taught. Keeping your it's like the thought of being responsible is keeping yourself under control, is like that's a responsible thing to do. And like holy shit. Oh my god. And it's like that has to be how responsibility is looked at, because if responsibility isn't looked at in that way, then you almost look a little bit outside of yourself. But as long as it's like you feel even just doing that, it's like I feel good. Oh God, I feel good about keeping myself under control, because that's the responsible thing to do. But it's not. It's like an entire facade. It's the whole pitching of that narrative is like rooted in this assumption about what I think I am, that's been, trickling for a long ass time. And as soon as that, if responsibility isn't about keeping yourself under control, then it's about letting go of yourself and being able to keep yourself under control, or that is a responsible thing to do, because it's entirely selfish. It's that synapse that's so afraid of passing something along, so afraid of being itself, that it's holding off some of it. And like, where on that spectrum are you? Are you fully passing along the information, or are you holding off a lot of that information? And they're not being even like, because again, if you want there to be a right way, you're going to want there to be a correct thing to pass along. And if you have a fear of being alone and being isolated, or loneliness, or any of those things, it's like there's almost going to be, despite it being uncertain the whole time as well, there's going to be a hesitation to try and maintain the control over the ability to not be alone, not be lonely. And like the feeling, like that experience of loneliness, if you think you're divided, versus the reality of there being no such thing, and yet also such a thing. And like that almost like loneliness being one of the world's biggest fears. And it's like where so many of our things come from, like fear of judgment, fear of death, fear of all these things, because it comes back to being alone again, despite that always being the case. Like you're always alone. You're born alone, you die alone, you experience your entire life alone, with a feeling of not being so. But as you it's like a trade-off every single time. You're trying to not feel alone. There's a desire for something, and then an expectation, and then it comes with need, and it comes with all these things. So it's like passing off your experience, like a fucking trade-off, dude. For like, if I don't want to be willing to be alone, or recognize that I'm going to assume certain things, and then it comes with the cost. It comes with the massive cost the whole time, instead of just looking that shit in the face and being like, okay, maybe I am. Maybe I've always been. Maybe I am right now. In my fucking, all my thoughts about everything that is separate from me is all conceptual. So like, I'm alone in that. I'm alone in my ideas of the world, my perspective of things, my assumptions about things. I always have been. And so what else is telling me that I'm not alone right now? And then there isn't so much of the fear that could and like, I'm not saying, I'm like, because I think I've said that before, like there's nothing to fear, there's nothing to worry about. And it's like, it'll yeah, in reality, no. And the more willing you are to be alone, yeah, it's less. It's not to say it's not going to trickle back, and it's not to say that it won't come up as you start to shift more, and express yourself more. But um yeah, I'm gonna stop.
That was brilliant. It shifts with the idea of me, because at the root of all of those questions, am I alone? It is, what do you mean by I? Like, who's the me that I'm talking about? And when you really let that idea go more and more and more, what you start recognizing is that you're the awareness of reality. That when you're saying, am I alone? You're talking about reality itself. It's just that we tend to, because we jump into this in the middle of the game, as it were, and we're not entirely sure what's happening. Like somebody was in the comments saying, like, "Oh shit, I'm behind on the live stream." So that's very much kind of what's happening to everybody. And what I mean is that, imagine you are intelligence, just intelligence. You don't exist anywhere. There's no reality. There's nothing. There's just intelligence and potential. But that means that you're kind of like a child. And what I mean is that all the things that we consider to be intelligence and humanity is really what we would call like street smarts and dealing with other fucking people, right? But intelligence itself is more like nature, right? It's more like plant life growing, right? It's very simple. It doesn't perceive a good and an evil. It has no enemies. It's just intelligence moving forward, growing, right? As everything. And that's what we are. And over fucking billions of years, or the experience of billions of years, that intelligence has expressed itself in more and more and more ways, but it's always been the same intelligence expressing itself in infinite variations. Well, now the intelligence is at the point where it has a form where it can go, holy fuck, look at all the expressing of myself I'm doing. And it's actually able to take in how much it is if it's willing to look. And what it's finding is that it's God. And so the question or the conversation we're having of, is it just me? Isn't a question of an individual person asking that, but of that intelligence that's always been here, coming to terms with the reality that there is no creator for it to meet, that it is existence and always will be. And when I say it, I mean me and I mean you. And it's just that now we're at a point where we can look at that. We can go, oh, wow, look how much I've been expressing. And actually take in how much we are. But it took us forever to get here, in the same way that it feels like it took forever throughout grade school and high school and beyond to get to a point where you could see your life with more clarity. The same is true collectively. It took billions of years. Our proverbial or our metaphorical grade school as the universe, our metaphorical high school as the universe, probably World War II, actually. That seems about high schoolish, right? Everything since then seems like a good high school period. But all of a sudden now we're coming to adulthood, or rather we have the possibility, the opportunity of coming to adulthood, to awareness, which comes back to the responsibility thing that we were talking about earlier. Because when we think about responsibility, when we're thinking about it in terms of our character, you're right. It's like I have to be responsible for these things because of these things that I have to that I'm obligated to follow, and because I identify with these things. So therefore, these are my responsibilities: my family, my bills, my job, my country, all that shit. Whereas your responsibility is your response all the time, and immediately the brain goes, "Well, what the fuck does that mean? You don't get to know that. Just pay attention." Because the more you pay attention to your response, the more you are aware of the ripples that your response makes, which is why you can either feel guilty or you can learn. Because if you're feeling guilty, then you're thinking about yourself. But if you're looking at the ripple you made and the consequence, or rather just the impact that it had, you're learning. And now you're changing. Right? And that's the whole point, is just to make the impact, to be yourself and let yourself learn. Right? But we keep wanting to go, yeah, but no, there's a right way. I got to follow that right way. Yeah, you'll find your own way. That's the whole thing. What's the way for you? Right? Not what's the secure way, not what's the way that's going to guarantee success, because that's all based on this idea of you, right? But right now, here in this moment, as you're listening to this, or as you're talking to somebody, or maybe somebody's interrupting you while you're listening to the podcast right now, what is your response to this? Don't think about it. Pay attention. Just pay attention. Slow down. Pay attention. How much are you hearing? How much are you listening? How much are you doubting what you're about to say or do? Just pay attention. And you'll learn more from that response than you'll ever learn from some fictional responsibility to something else. Because you're paying attention. This is why children learn so fast. And he's like, why do children learn so fast? I'm at the age of 5 years old. It's because they're doing nothing but paying attention. And then we get in there like, you got to live like this. You got to think of yourself like this. You got to start talking like this. You got to act like this. You got to pay attention to all this shit. And they're just like, but I was just here paying attention. Like, I've just been learning this whole time. And now I've got other shit I got to learn. And it's like, yeah, shit that's irrelevant to you until maybe later on. Instead of learning from each and every moment, they would be informed by otherwise. And we just superimpose what we think is important to them. And that's it. I heard a woman the other day. She was talking about how the schooling system is meant to teach our children how to be productive members of society. And I have heard that shit before, but I forgot hearing that specific turn of phrase. What a fucking terrible thing. It's like, it's a conditioning camp for children, so they'll be useful to us. That seems okay.
Seems super reasonable. I'm absolutely behind that way of because it's just maintaining what we've continued to do. But the Yeah, the amount of things, and so that's funny because that then reminds me of the thing that I was thinking, like, that I was thinking of before, as I'm, like, hesitating, I'm like, "Oh, fuck, I had a thought, and then it wasn't there, and then here we go, and then here I am." And it's funny how when you look at that and you're like, "Huh, that is interesting," that there is that hesitation, that assumption, and, like, that grasping for there to be a right thing or, like, a right way to take something, or just having faith in yourself to just express whatever's there and just kinda open your mouth and see what happens and see what is expressed. When there is a thought that, like, there's a right way to respond or a way you wanna take it, if you're assuming that you can be in control, there's gonna be the desire to, like, hold on to that instead of just expressing what's there. And so with school, it's just like how much would things change if, children from birth were just raised with it, not tried to be steered in any direction, but there wouldn't be that sense of control. And so, like, how much would reality change if they're just left to their own devices? Because I was on doing the DU games night. Shout out Discord. Shout out Jazz. Appreciate you setting that up. That was a lot of fun. And there was one game we were playing where I remembered, like, the periodic table and how Na is sodium and K is potassium. I was like, "Oh my god." I went through an entire year, an entire probably month or 2 of learning the periodic table. It's not to say there haven't been points in my life where I've remembered it, but it's like, did I spend, like, months in a classroom learning this just so I could remember it and bring it up and then laugh about how silly it was that I learned it at that point in my life. Like, all of the things that are pushed on us and ways of living, and it's just conditioning, not for a benefit. Like, so many people I hear joking about school and how crazy it is, and even college. Like, you take classes and it's to get a piece of paper. You go to school to be taught how to follow rules, how to follow, to be taught how to follow. It's not even about the material because a lot of that is just conditioning and propaganda as well. Like, most history classes in countries, like, they teach different things. They teach what they want you to know or hear or learn. And it really fucking brings into question, I know we've talked about this before, but, like, what we're doing, and you start to scratch your head about, like, really what we're trying to do here, and it's yeah, maintain ourself, maintain yeah.
Agreed. Agreed. That's interesting. I mean, it's what would be the difference, right? Like, because we have the schooling system as it is right now, but how did we learn before the schooling system as it is right now? Well, we learned from our environment, right? Like children who, and it was rare for a very long time, but children who knew how to write and do math were typically children of people who did writing and math in their business, right? So if you, for example, had a counting house, or if you owned a carriage company, or if you owned anything like that, you would typically have to work with math. You would typically have to exchange gold and whatnot, and so you would have to learn that, and you probably learned that from the person who taught you, and they probably learned that from the person who taught them, and so on and so forth. So we've always learned from our environment. So the children who knew that were the children of parents who knew that and expressed an interest in learning that because it was important to their life. Okay. And they passed it on to their kids. Then schooling came about, and a bunch of adults who never learned to read, couldn't do math, went, "You're going to be smarter than me, kid. Get to that school." Instead of learning to read. Why didn't they all go to the school? Right? Well, it's because the parents don't want to be responsible for what their children are learning, because then they have to be responsible for their own learning, which is the real bitch about homeschooling. is that because you're not relying on that fear-based motivator, in other words, you're going to fail if you don't work fucking hard, you have to rely on an entirely different motivator, which is enthusiasm. Your enthusiasm for learning, because then you become the environment of the child, and the environment tells the child, well, this is part of your environment. Look at all the stuff in it. So if you, for example, were interested in chemistry, and you had a big periodic table, periodic chart on your wall in your house, and you had a kid, that kid would more than likely grow up learning about the periodic table, right? But that said, how much does that say about how we could change different parts of our environment? Like, how many buildings, for example, are just sterile? There's nothing educational on the walls, there's nothing interesting on the walls. I mean, when you walk around a city where they do those murals, for example, doesn't that like light something up in your heart when you're walking around, all of a sudden a bare wall has been turned into something fucking gorgeous or creative or even educational, telling you something about the goddamn place, right? You're just like, that is amazing. Why does your heart sing like that? Because your environment is being fucking enriching. Not somebody coming over to you going, you need to learn this. Here, look at this picture. Look at it. It's important to me. Nothing like that. It's just in the environment, giving you the opportunity. It's all we really need to do. But so much of our environment isn't in any way enriching or educational. So much of it is just profit centric, right? So much of it. And so what are we really learning? Profit, control, that we need more. We're learning about that state of mind of accumulation, of achievement, of defining myself through materialism. That's what we're learning all the time because that's our fucking environment. So it's interesting because we try to basically superimpose that with this educational structure. It's structure. So it's like we're going to teach you to be a greedy, selfish individual, stepping on everybody you can to get ahead because if you don't, you're not enough. But go to school so we can feel like you're a civilized human being.
So you can be under control and not at all experience any sort of beyond the age of 5, like, expression of yourself besides pockets. And it's like, if you really take in, like, fucking A, dude, like, the amount that I have bought I had bought into just, like, following rules. Like, and I know that's not a unique experience at all, but, like, I was really good at following rules, and, like, that's gonna chip away every time. Even, like, oh my god, there's, like, people talk about dopamine, whatever, all that stuff, but, like, a dopamine hit from, like, following a rule and getting a pat on the back for it, like, oh my god, that just takes further and further from being myself, reinforces that there's a right way, that someone else has the right way, that someone else is gonna tell you the right way, and as long as you do that, you're gonna feel good and be able to feel good about yourself. Like, man, and it's all a component of, when I think about myself, when I focus on myself, when I assume that I am this thing that, fluctuates, goes up and down, or and it's not to say like, it's not to say that I'm not also. Like, I think there's a side of that, and it's like, again, dualistic unity, and that was a side of the podcast that I didn't want to look at. Like, it's not to say that I'm it's not to say that I'm not Andrew, but it's also not to say that it's not to say that I am. Like, it's not, I can't fall on one side or the other. Like, I can't discount the experience, but then it's like, what am I right now? And like, even just looking at older clips or older videos, like, and going back to older videos and whatnot can be, I don't know, interesting for me because I see again, I look at myself in a certain way because that's been my fucking focus my whole life. So of course, notice details about that no one else would even realize or recognize. And then that brings into question just right now, like, any focus on myself is just discounting the entirety of experience itself, and thinking again, like we were talking about earlier, like being under control, having control of the situation. And so going back, like I would be so quick to say like, "Oh, you're not what you think." Like, "You're not I'm not Andrew. I'm not Andrew." And I know I'm not wrong, but okay. I'm like,
It's the both and neither thing.
yeah.
Welcome to the reason I always say both and neither. Because yes, you're Andrew, but Andrew's not what you think you are. So you have the experience of being what you think you are, but that's actually not what's happening. It's just that you're twisting whatever's happening according to what you think you are, which is really fun. So you are both mortal and God, and neither, because they're both conceptual. So this is why you're like, I'm not sure what I am. And I just said yes, because that's really it. Like you just are. We just are. You know, you really like if there wasn't an us, there would be a nothing. By virtue of there not being non-existence, we exist. It's interesting. It's fun because this is existence. This is just, but again, like if you had existence for long enough, that existence would look at itself and it would experience itself accordingly. Because as soon as you look at yourself, you're experiencing something opposite because you can't look at yourself without perceiving it as separate, right?
No. Oh, man. Every time. So every time, whether it's physically looking in a mirror, looking at yourself in terms of like a report card or a judgment, or even talking about yourself or someone talking to you, like immediately there's a dichotomy. Immediately there's, oh man, so like the experience of duality really is the root of experience. Like it can't happen without, and yet, oh gosh, there's like a sort of, it's immediately contradictory of what's going on and yet also necessary. It's like, oh shit. So like it's necessary but contradictory at the same time. And so it's
Dualistic unity.
that's why we've heard so many people say, like, your name doesn't make any sense. It's like, yeah, this doesn't make any sense until you try to make something of it and try to have some idea of how it should be going. Oh my God. Because there's no, like, you're sitting in eternity, no necessary direction whatsoever. There's no necessary direction to take anything in ever. It's just what it is. Like all, social norms, societal conditioning is,
God's commandments.
oh gosh, like, cuz and it skews towards feeling better despite, the reality of birth and death not going away, but we just we just think about fucking like heaven and hold on to that just to continue despite it not being the case. Like if everyone tomorrow was like honest with themselves, like, yeah, there's no heaven. Like this is it. This is what we got. This is what we get. Like, ooh, man, how much all those thoughts about, how you're living your life, what you're focusing on, judgments of yourself, judgments of others. Like, I'm not saying it would change immediately, but there would be a reprioritization in a lot of ways. Like if we were actually honest with like the reality of uncertainty, anything beyond right now, anything to come, anything, after death, whatever, like things would change quick because a lot of what we do is like the next thing, the next thing, the next thing. Tomorrow, looking ahead, looking to something else. Some other looking at a something you're looking forward to, even. Like, there's no guarantee in that or how it's going to be or how it's going to seem at all. Like, the hit of excitement is also an addictive experience that goes hand in hand with the hit of fear. And it all takes me out of this right now. And so no wonder we're not taught. We're not taught to pay attention. We're not taught to we're taught to focus on the contradiction instead of the reality. Because everything's here. Everything's here. And so if there is a skew towards comfort, then there's going to be a desire to focus on the contradiction, the side of the, you know, the dualistic side instead of unity. And that's why fucking spirituality paints unity as like this, nice, with this nice veil, love and light, instead of looking at the reality that would then actually, shift things more, hypothetically.
Well said. I've said this before, but it's going to ring a little bit more true now. There is nothing that has changed my life more than the recognition that I am everything and I'm here forever. The genuine recognition, not the belief, that won't do shit, but to actually get out of your way enough to go, fuck. Like, it's just me, and to pay attention accordingly. It changes how you deal with everything. It changes how you deal with what you eat, what you buy, how you talk to people, how you treat them. And it doesn't mean that there is suddenly a set way to treat people that's unifying, but all of a sudden there is a way to treat people that is the extension of your awareness and your self honesty. And then that has its own intelligence. But that's the root of everything I've ever said on Dualistic Unity. It's just me forever. But it's being willing to deal with that and to recognize that whatever your perception of that is, that's not the case. That it's what remains. The reality is what remains when you're not attaching to one perception to the other. This is why it's so dangerous to say things like, I'm God. I do it because the shock factor to the ego. The ego's like, what the fuck? What are you saying? Because it contradicts all kinds of ideas about God and my limited idea of myself, right? But even that, you're not God. There's no God. There's just you. And there's a gap between the idea you have of yourself and the idea you have of reality. And that gap is the concept of God. Right? And once you get rid of the idea of yourself, or rather just stop believing any idea of yourself is the truth, then you start to recognize that it's all just interplay all the time. And the best thing you can do is just pay attention, have some faith in yourself, not the idea of you that you're thinking about, but actually the act of you that's happening from moment to moment to moment. And that's it. And then all of a sudden we learn together. But we want to mitigate all the danger and the risk. We're like, okay, well, if I am myself, things are going to go well, right? What do you mean by well? Because that sounds a lot like your preferences, right? And so there's a lot of stuff to work on there. And it's just really interesting, right? For sure. We have about 20 minutes left. And so I just wanted to make a quick announcement because it's fucking exciting. A week or so ago, we decided that we were going to do a marathon episode where we were fundraising for a ticket for somebody to come to the Dualistic Unity retreat in California. And we were happy to say that we raised that ticket amount, which is fucking amazing. I am even happier to say that since then, we've raised almost another ticket. In fact, we're only $480 away from that second ticket. If anybody would like to help, if you would like to donate, go to dualisticunity.com/donate. You can still throw a little bit in there. Doesn't matter if it's $5 or $10, really doesn't, but it's going to help someone who can't get to the retreat otherwise get to that retreat. Just incredible. I just want to say, holy fucking shit, because this is it. Is people who are doing this, there's this element, they're like, well, I could feel really good about this because I'm helping someone. Or you can recognize you are facilitating something for another version of yourself that at one point in your life would have changed everything. That's it. Just do it because you can. Don't do it to save someone. Don't do it to, make yourself feel better. Do it because you can, and we all benefit. We all benefit. And that person goes out and makes ripples after the fact, as the ripple, as the pond, because there's no separation. This is where all of this gets fucking confusing, is because I could say that it's the conversation I had with Buddy on TikTok. You have to admit you're doing good. You have to admit that you're helping people. You have to admit, I don't have to admit shit, because all of that comes down to this perception that you and I are separate, that there is, in fact, a you and I. And while there's the experience of you and I, that doesn't mean that we're separate eyes. And that's really it. Is the recognition of that. It means that you give up all of that fucking pedestal. But on the other hand, you also give up the fucking hole that you've been digging yourself. Because you stop the oscillation. That's all based on the fictional you that's divided from everything else. This has been a fun episode.
It has. It's almost like walking down a path and like having a bunch of holes, and like you keep falling into holes, and then you keep climbing out of them, and you keep falling into holes, and like every time it's like digging holes, and then so like you climb up the dirt, and then you go into the hole, and then you climb up the dirt, and then you go into the hole, and then instead of just not digging holes and not needing the one to counteract the other, and so it's like equally as humbling as it is empowering, because it's like you're not using things to think about yourself. And like, oh my gosh, it's fascinating how much, and like, I guess because I don't know, part of me is realizing I'm just or feeling like I'm just seeing things again. It's always like feels like for the first
I'm going to
time,
get a
but
montage of all the times you said that on the podcast.
round and round we go, brother. In eternity, just
That's why I laugh, man, because I hear myself for 20 years.
like the ways to try and feel better about yourself. It's like they have more pull the less willing you are to admit that there's the sides that suck you down, that pull you down, that you're not willing to admit, the pits and the reality of that pit that's reinforced by that way that you think about yourself to feel better. And as you don't do that anymore, as you don't do those things, there's still almost can be like it feels like a carryover, but again, it's just like grasping for something. It's like grasping for some sense of knowing how you're doing, even not instead of just letting go, and again, it's like thinking about yourself. It's just wanting to hold on to that despite it cutting down on your experience so much and like forcing you to just live in this back and forth and back and forth and back and forth. And again, like even assuming that that's not part of it, like back and forths, but it's how much influence how much am I causing those back and forths, and not causing, but just, having sway over even just how seriously I take the back and forths, because the back and forths are going to back and forth. And if you're not willing to take responsibility for, for yourself, for the choices that you make, for the ways that you experience things, there's going to be more or less pull. And it ties into, how willing you are to be yourself and just authentically express that. And when it comes to, like you were mentioning with the donations and whatnot, and doing it for a version of yourself that would really appreciate that. And you can do that every fucking day and every moment Like, if you think about yourself when you're feeling in the pit and like you're not judging so much outside of yourself, it's like you see someone not taking themselves as seriously. Like, there's an appreciation there because you see that that's even possible. So you can do that every day and just, it's like doing it for that. And again, not doing it for anyone but yourself, but doing it for
It's
that
the same thing,
person.
right?
Yeah.
Isn't it? If you're doing it for yourself, you're doing it for that person. They're the same thing. That's the fucking paradox. If it's genuinely you being you, that's you being them, which means you're reflecting them to a greater degree. It's not about them.
Oh, and so where, because you don't have control over how someone sees themselves. And so if you're reflecting yourself, you're reflecting that back to them. And if they're not, if they're, if they have deeper self judgments or not trying to be themselves or trying to be more, they're going to judge. If they feel like they're less, there's almost either like, and you never, like, you just don't know where they're going to fall on that spectrum, but it's going to be reflective. And so depending where someone sits in themselves, it's going to be reflective of that. And like the more you're being yourself, the more it's like more intense that reflection is. And so it takes, you know, takes some guts to do it. But it's like, yeah, does it? Or is it the easiest thing to do? The least, with at least less hesitation?
Takes
I
more
don't
effort
know.
to hesitate. That's really what it is. Like we think again that we're in this process of letting go, but it's only because we're holding on. Think about that. All right? You've been holding on for a really long time. Now you're so convinced you have to that just letting go a little bit, just unclenching your fingers is an effort. But it's only an effort because you're still convinced you should be holding on. So the effort is really in you. The battle between holding on and letting go is entirely in you, and none of it would exist at all if the reason that you were holding on wasn't there anymore. So the effort is keeping that reason. It's the holding on still and the letting go, still effort. None of which is important. You can just let go, right? And that's not the letting go of all your shit. That's not having any shit. That's just being here. But this is why when we go out there, we're like, I'm going to help someone experience freedom. You are just helping them imprison themselves further because you're imprisoning yourself further. This is why Jesus was talking to the priests and he's like, you go and you find a convert and you make them twice as damned as you because you're following something and now they're following you following something. Right? So you actually made it harder for them to find themselves. Whereas if you want to set people free, let them go. Let them go. Be free. Be free. Embody it. Because that's them being free suddenly in their reality for them to deal with, for them to come face to face with, and to have that option. This is why it's important when you go out and you're being yourself and somebody judges you and they try and drag you down, you recognize you just did some fucking great work just in being yourself. The reason they're judging you is because they're facing something in themselves. You don't get to control the ripple or the process. It's all you, which means that you're going to translate things in infinite different ways. But how can you learn if nobody around you is allowing themselves to be an example of what you could be? And that's it. We're learning from ourselves. So just be yourself. Everybody learns without you ever having to teach because there is no teacher or student.
Oh man. And like, oh God, how much that comes back to just feeling like you can be in control and thinking that there's a right way to do that and a reliance on that. But like if you're just expressing yourself, then and someone judges you, it's like immediately they're at odds with themselves. Immediately they have to look at themselves. And if they don't want to, they just keep buying into it. But like, oh gosh, and that one, dude, like the judgment, the fear of judgment and all that stuff, like again, because it's not the comfortable, nice sort of feeling. And so, oh my God, with spirituality, it's like if you're trying to be spiritual, love and light, all that stuff, like you're gonna teeter on this line. Like you're very much keeping yourself in control, trying to maintain control, trying to be seen in a nice, pleasant sort of way, despite it still not being able to be under control. And you can't like, gosh, you can't even do that. And as I'm like, like as I'm talking, my mind, like, I don't know, I maybe I'm just, yeah, still
No,
doing stuff.
no, that's exactly the
I know.
point, though. You see, this is why I love Zen. Zen brings you full circle to this fucking short circuit where you're like, well, then, but just live there. See, isn't it funny? We want out of there. We're like, no, there's got to be more to problem solve. There's got to be more. There's got to be another insight. I got to keep digging. I got to learn more. I got to change more. No, just be. That's the short circuit. That's the reason for the story of the stonecutter. For example, it goes full circle right back to where you fucking are. Right? That's the point. Where you are is reality. What you are is reality. And all we learn from is reality. So that's all you have to do. But immediately we're like, well, what does that mean? Not that. You can do that all you like. You're still doing what you're supposed to do. That's the beautiful part about this. We're all doing it, regardless of what we tell ourselves. It's just how much are you aware of it? How much are you fighting it? How much are you distorting it? That's really all it is. And you could say, "Oh, well, I'm still distorting it," but that idea of you isn't the reality. This is just process. This is just the dualistic spectrum. And collectively, we are working through something. And individually, we all take it on as if it's just ourselves.
Yeah. And seeing like there not being a way to like do something for someone else outside of just expressing yourself. It's like that's the one thing. It's like I want to avoid that one because that one's on me. Like the rest is almost something that can be figured out, like a way to express something. But again, it's not even figured out because it's like assuming that it can be figured out. Just doing something else, like following something, thinking that and then assuming that the right thing can be figured out based on the response. Not realizing like the response is going to be based on where someone is at. It's always going to be based on where someone's at. And so there's no control over the response, but you can subdue yourself that's not doing anyone any good. Because, like, when you think about judgment and like being judged versus not being judged, like, what does not being judged even do for anyone else outside of yourself? Holy shit.
It gives them
Ooh.
space in the same way it gives you space. This is the paradox. You're always going to treat other people the way you're treating yourself.
Oh, goodness gracious. I'm like, I'm getting some short circuits on this episode. But like,
This is why I'm
'Cause
crazy, buddy. This is why. This is why I laugh, is because at the end of the day, anything that I'm taking too seriously is just for me to take seriously so I can feel like I'm doing something. And it's absurd. At the end of the day, it's all based on this illusion that I'm separate from all of you, from everything. That I'm this idea of myself, all of that shit. And it's all just so I can feel like I have the option of control. So I can feel like, maybe I'll get what I want. And at the end of the day, all of that shit just ends up turning to ash. Just turns to ash. And that's the whole thing, is that even if you get what you want, it's not usually what you want, because what you really wanted to be was to be complete, was to feel complete. And that's the whole thing. It's this is why it's interesting, because sometimes people will say like I haven't been coming to the podcast because I've just been kind of living in this place in my life where I'm not thinking about a lot. Perfect. How's that going? Enjoy yourself as much as you can, because you don't have to be assessing your progress all this time. You don't have to be trying to make a ripple. You don't have to be, in fact, working on yourself, because what you're working on is, in fact, the fiction that's fucking you. So you can just relax. You can just slow down, pay attention, and watch all that shit unravel. But we want to find a way to get out now, right? I want to find a way to feel better now, right? And all of that just drags it farther away. Because what you're looking for isn't what you think you're looking for. What you're really looking for is what you are.
it's like what you're really looking for is the experience where you're not looking for something,
Well said.
which can happen right now. Which can just happen right now. And like, oh man, and like everything's on the table, because like everything's on the table. It's like, if that's it, if it's the experience of not looking, it's like that's the end point that like we're all searching for, freedom, all of it. It's like that happens when you stop looking for freedom. It happens when you stop trying to improve yourself, focused on yourself, getting somewhere, becoming something, avoiding feeling certain other ways about yourself. Like that point where you're not looking to get somewhere, looking for the right thing to do. Just like the experience of not looking for the right way or fearing the wrong way, because they go hand in hand. Like if that's, the pinnacle, like you can do that right now by just being what you are. And like that's, and even with, because when I get caught up in like hesitating or forgetting what I'm saying or stumbling on my words or whatever, there'll be like this immediate sort of like, this can't happen. This is wrong. This can't be going on right now, because that's like so deeply in there for me. But again, it's like, is it? Am I doubling down on it as I express it? Like, is it even just like, and coming to terms with like, that's on the table too? Immediately when I do kind of like even just recognize that, it's like there is a cessation of it. But if I'm holding on to that perspective, it sucks me down real quick.
Yeah. And this is why, when I feel all the pressure building up, all the thoughts, all the weight, all the ray, I just exhale. I just go right back to reality, because none of it is, and I'm just taking it seriously. So I change my focus. I change my prioritization. Instead of dwelling in the thought, I dwell in my breath. And just like that, it disappears. And I go back to being reality. It's very much like the Zen story I told you before, of a master who's just sitting, chilling, doing his thing, and the student comes up and he's like, I've traveled from far and wide. I've studied under numerous masters. I've memorized all of the scrolls. I've learned all the teachings, and I cannot understand. I don't grasp enlightenment. Tell me, what am I missing? And the master just looks over at a piece of paper he's got on the wall, and he just draws the character for attention. Doesn't say a word. He just draws the character for attention. And the student looks at it. He's like, the fuck does that mean? So he does it again. He draws attention again. He's like, what am I supposed to get out of that? How am I supposed to learn anything about enlightenment from that? And so he just draws attention again. And that's the whole point of the story. It's just to pay attention and let the rest take care of itself. But that's why, we hear about faith and humility, right? In religion, in spiritual paths. Why? Because it's attention to hear with less of you in the way. The problem is if it's you having faith and humility, that fucks it all up. And that's the fun part. This has been a grand episode. We're going to continue on Patreon. It's a tier 1 call today. It's an all tiers call. It's only $5 a month. If you haven't joined us on Patreon yet, definitely do consider it. There's also a 7-day free trial, which we know that you will love. We also have some Patreon only episodes that are going to start coming very soon. We're going to be recording our first one this Friday. It's going to star all 4 of the hosts as often as we can. So definitely tune into that on Patreon. If you haven't already, it's definitely worth joining. So we'll see you on Patreon in about 15 minutes, everybody. Thank you so much for being you.
Bye, everyone.